Hey, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming to our talk this morning or this evening, whatever time it is for you. As many of you know, my name is Greg Findley, and I'm one of the course directors for our flagship course here at Terra.do called Climate Change Learning for Action. I want to say hello to our fellows from the Uriels who are graduating this Friday, and also to the Vaquitas fellows who are just getting going in their course. Our speaker today is Alison Smart. Alison works with leaders across science, design, technology, business, and culture to develop useful, resonant, and beautiful climate change tools and resources. Through her role as executive director at Probable Futures, a non-commercial climate literacy initiative, she helps people across different industries and geographies build their capacities to evaluate and address climate risk. Prior to Probable Futures, she served as vice president for the Woodwell Climate Research Center. Having come to climate change communications after spending the earlier part of her career in the arts, Alison believes that not only do we all have the capability to understand the science and context of climate change, but that everyone will need that understanding as we navigate through a changing climate and a changing world. So thank you, Alison, for being with us today, and welcome. And I'm letting a few more people in, and then let's take it away.
Great, thank you, Greg. Hello, everyone. I know a lot of you are on mute, but anyone who is comfortable, I would love to hear a hello from people just to kind of feel and hear your energy in the room. So hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much. I was very lucky to spend the past 4 days at a conference with a bunch of leaders doing social impact work from all over the world. So I'm really feeling that like in-person energy right now. And so I want to be able to bring that back into the Zoom space because I'm super grateful to be here with all of you today. I'm really grateful that you all have decided to build your own capacities and climate change and move into this space or wherever you are in your journey. At Probable Futures, we really believe that climate change needs to be really taken out of environmentalism and just be embedded into every conversation in every different part of society. So it seems like that is what you're all doing here is bringing your spaces bringing this information back into your spaces. So super excited to be here. I'm going to share my screen and get started. Greg, feel free to keep me honest on time or give me, signals of how we're doing. I'm usually pretty good on time, but just feel free to jump in. So,
okay, will do. Thanks, Alison. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So at Probable Futures, we speak with leaders in a lot of different sectors and different industries and in different parts of the world who want to better understand climate change. And many of them are thinking about it for the first time, or sometimes it's part of their job now when it wasn't previously. But the most important thing that we've learned in that experience is that every leader, no matter where they are in the world or what kind of community they lead, can really benefit from the same orientation and the same fundamentals on climate change. And they can also use similar frameworks for taking action on resiliency, adaptation, mitigation. And we believe that there are 3 tools that leaders really need when tackling climate change for the first time. Context, preparation, and imagination. So we'll get into context first because that's kind of the most fundamental. Because what is the context for climate change when the Earth is 4.5 billion years old and our human species is younger than that and our civilization is much younger still? So how should we even think about the importance of a changing climate today? So we're going to start by examining this question and traveling back into the history of our climate and our species to find the answer. And let's start with our civilization, because before the climate started to change in the 20th and 21st centuries, we were the beneficiaries of an unusually stable climate. One where the global average temperature and by extension, the climate was largely unchanged for about 12,000 years. And we know this thanks to climate science. So here we're looking at a graph of the history of the global average temperature. And the graph starts at the dawn of civilization, 10,000 BCE, about 12,000 years ago. And this graph compares the global average temperature of each of these years to that of the late 19th century. So the way to understand this graph, the closer the data point is to zero, the more stable the global average temperature was. So you can see here that over the past 12,000 years, there really has been a very narrow range of global average temperatures. It barely even fluctuated a degree. So we're going to call this green band here the civilization band. And this stability in the climate is what allowed humans to do things like invent agriculture, settle into permanent communities, and have things like governments and economies and schools and corporations, eventually building up this super complex society that we live in today. We owe the complexity of our society today to climate stability, fundamentally. The data for this graph comes from, I know that you've learned about some paleoclimate and about climate models. So the data for the graphs that we're looking at here come from mainly ice cores in the Antarctic, where they sample the air and find what the CO2 concentration in the global average temperature was at that point. And then we'll layer on different types of paleoclimate data too. But it happened to be that the climate wasn't just stable, it actually happened to be perfect for us. There were large expanses of temperate land. There were stable seasonal patterns that we were able to understand and then plan on, and nowhere on Earth was it too hot for the human body. So why didn't humans settle before 10,000 BCE? Well, conversely, it's because the climate wasn't stable. Our first ancestors emerged in Africa around 200,000 years ago, but for about 180,000 of those years, we were a nomadic hunting and gathering species. And looking at this chart, we get a sense for why. The climate changed dramatically over those 180,000 years. So we'll layer on this yellow band here and call this the human civilization temperature band. And at a changing climate at this magnitude really just was not conducive to settling into one place. And if we go back even farther into history, we can see that a stable climate is certainly not guaranteed. The Earth has actually been much hotter than it has been during human existence. And so hot, in fact, that back 70, 80, 90 million years ago, only reptiles and insects, things like dinosaurs, could live above water. But I'll direct your attention toward the right-hand side of the screen here, where I've added on more recent temperature observations, as well as climate model data in the red there. And what we see there is that we're actually already starting to break out of that civilization temperature band. And if we continue on the same trajectory, we'll be breaking out of that human existence temperature band before the end of the century. So this graph helps us see that climate change isn't just about warmer temperatures, it's about losing stability. And it's about the fact that maintaining civilization in a changing climate is unprecedented for our species. And in a more unstable world, climate awareness, something that we call climate awareness, we think is an essential mindset. And we're going to talk about that throughout this presentation and our conversation today. And the reason it's such an important thing is because a stable climate has been assumed in every aspect of our society. It's in our food systems, it's in our infrastructure and the way that our infrastructure is built. It's in our homes, and it's even in our cultural practices. They are all built around the patterns of a stable climate. So what happens when that stable climate begins to deteriorate? What parts of society and what parts of life are more precarious than they were before? Well, that's up to us to start to unpack these layers and start to expose those climate assumptions. So let's start with a few kind of straightforward ones. City storm sewers are designed for certain levels of precipitation. Power systems and power plants are meant to withstand certain max temperatures or load factors. Residences in many places are meant to keep heat in rather than keep heat out. grades of street asphalt are often selected by the latitude, so essentially selected by temperature. I live in the US, in the northern US, and there are different grades of asphalt in Florida than there are where I live in Massachusetts. And all agriculture, whether it's irrigated or not, is dependent on steady precipitation at some level. And so these are some pretty kind of straightforward, recognizable ones, but every community, every sector, and every industry has assumed climate stability in different ways. And it's going to be up to those communities. And we hope that these resources will help empower those communities to start to unpack those assumptions. And fortunately, because of climate science, we know a lot about how the climate will change at each increment of warming. And so in other words, again, we need to think ahead and prepare so we can start using the science that we have at hand to plan for the warming that's assured, and also to avoid further levels of warming that would bring further levels of destabilization. And to do that, we need the science, of course, but we need to present it in a way that resonates with people who are making decisions in the real world. And the science needs to actually answer relevant real world questions. And this was the impetus for starting Probable Futures. So I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes here kind of on the origin story. The initiative was founded by someone named Spencer Glendon, and it grew out of a collaboration that got started when I was serving as the vice president of the Woodwell Climate Research Center. So my background, as Greg said before that, was in the arts. So I was recruited to Woodwell Climate Research Center, not because I had a science background, but because I had a storytelling background. So the climate scientists at Woodwell were looking for help from non-scientists like me and in other parts of society. They were looking for people who could help them present their science in a way that people then could meaningfully use it. And Spencer Glendon was similarly an outsider to climate science. He had spent part of his 20-year career as a thought leader in finance, translating climate science, the climate science that he was learning for the financial world. So in short, the two of us were generalists who were able to start bridging this gap between climate science and other aspects of culture and society. And part of the reason we started doing this is because we were used to seeing climate change representations that looked like this, and this, and this. And this is not to throw shade on the information in this. This is super important science that we have and that we can use, but it's not presented in a particularly helpful way. And it also doesn't signal that it's for anyone that's from outside of the scientific community. And we really wanted to help address that. So we set off to build a resource that would show how useful, intuitive, and personal, frankly, that climate science could be. And Woodwell Climate would be our partner in that, as they are today. So of course, we knew that the heart of our initiative would be maps. Climate change is a physical phenomenon, and maps are extremely intuitive and they're interactive. They can help us better understand the physicality of the places that we know, but they can also encourage exploration of other places. So we built Probable Futures to empower the user to see climate change through their own lens. We make data available about the most fundamental first order impacts of climate change: temperature, precipitation, drought, without any real additional analysis on top. And this is because climate change is going to mean really different things to different communities. As we were talking about earlier, climate stability has been assumed into every community in different ways. So let's take this map of 90+ degree days just out of Bogota, Colombia, for example. Really, this community is best positioned to understand what, by 3 degrees Celsius, an additional 110 days above 90 per year would mean for them, for their infrastructure, for their industries, for their schools. they might be actually very interested in another place, possibly upstream of this community. Really, they're the ones that are going to know best. And so we need to give that information. We're not going to be able to provide answers for all of the impacts of climate change, all of the societal impacts. So what we can do is give people good tools, prompt relevant questions, and have a framework for thinking through the impacts. So now I'm going to run through a few global maps with you to give you a big picture sense of how the climate is going to change at different levels of warming. We're going to dig into the science, the climate models behind these maps a little bit, and then we're going to start to zoom into some more specific places and examine them. So what we're looking at here is a map from the probablefutures.org site. It is visualizing the number of days per year above 35 degrees C or 95 degrees Fahrenheit at each level of warming. So the first level of warming that we're at here, as you can see at the top where it says 0.5 degrees C past. So all of our maps start with a past scenario, so we know what we're comparing against. These climate models start in the time period of 1971 to 2000. And during that time, the Earth had already warmed about 0.5 degree Celsius. So that is the starting point for each of these maps. And then it goes through the different levels of warming. 1 degree, which we consider the present warming scenario, since we're about 1.2, 1.3 above pre-industrial temperatures now, and then so on. So I'm going to run through the scenarios on the maps here. So the way to understand this map is it's depicting the number of days above 35 degrees C in each given place in an average year at each level of warming. So 1 degree, 1.5, 2, 2.5, and 3. I'll go back through that again and just point out the key in the left-hand corner, which coordinates to the colors. So the places in green only see these kinds of temperatures, something like less than a week per year. On the other end, the darkest red shows places that experience these temperatures frequently, more than half of the year. So what you can notice is the darker pinks expand, particularly within the tropics, and the green expanding northward. So 1 degree C, 1.5, 2, 2.5, and 3. So I'll move on to wet bulb temperature here. Not sure if you've learned about wet bulb temperature yet, but it's a really important way to measure heat because it has a lot of implications for the human body. Humans can actually withstand pretty high temperatures. What we can't withstand are really high temperatures and really high humidity. We are mammals and we need to offload heat. We do that by sweating, and the air around us needs to be able to accept that sweat. So we're really interested in how wet bulb temperature will change at different levels of warming. Right now, we are looking at a map of the number of days per year at each level of warming of 28 degrees C or 82 degrees Fahrenheit wet bulb temperature. So that means 28 degrees C and 100% humidity. There can also be different temperature combinations. So it could be 26 degrees C and something like 75% humidity. So there are different combinations, but kind of the easiest way to think about it is 28 degrees C and 100% humidity. So looking at this map of the past climate, we can see that it's actually a pretty rare temperature. It doesn't happen very often in most places that even experience it at all. I mean, most of the world, let's just observe that most of the world is gray here. So in most places, this particular temperature threshold just doesn't happen. And in most other places, it's something like, if you look at the key does change. So it's important to kind of keep looking down at the key and figuring out what the colors mean there. But most places experience it less than a couple of weeks a year. Most places actually only experience it something like 1 to 3 days. So let's see how this changes as we go through the warming scenarios. 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, and 3. So this is really a significant difference. These are some of the biggest changes, relative changes that we see is in wet bulb heat maps. Okay, keep moving. Drought. We're looking at a drought map now. So what this is depicting is at each level of warming, the annual likelihood of what used to be considered an extreme drought in that place. So the way to understand this map is that the darker the orange or the red, the more likely it is that that place will experience a drought that used to be quite rare for that place. So we'll start at the past climate scenario. 1 degree, 1.5, 2, 2.5, and 3. Go back one more time. 2, 2.5, and 3. Now let's move on to precipitation. So this map is depicting the 1 in 100 year storm. So I imagine many of you have heard that terminology before, the 1 in 100 year storm. That term is actually in a way a product of our stable climate, that we came up with a term for what was really just a 1% storm. And we named it a 1 in 100 year storm because it kind of assumes that every 100 years is comparable. So it means, 1% storm, a storm with a very low chance of happening, but still with, with some probability of happening. So as I move through the warming scenarios here, the darker the blue, the more likely it is that, or the more frequently a 1 in 100 year storm will happen in that place. And the 1 in 100 year storm that we're referring to is what the old 1 in 100 year storm was for that place. So that old 1 in 100 year storm will be happening more frequently at every level of warming. And so that's what this map depicts. So we start at 1 to see the change, 1.5, 2, 2.5, and 3. So what we see here is that the vast majority of the world is experiencing that 1 in 100 year storm on an annual basis, at least twice as likely, and in some places 3, 4, 5, up to 10, even in some places 15 times more likely. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the data behind the maps. I understand that some of you may have already learned about climate models, maybe others haven't. But the climate models that underpin the probable futures maps, they are not proprietary. They're not even our models. They're the world's models. They belong to the public. So climate scientists have been developing these models over the past 40 years. It is public information, but it has never been kind of organized and made available in a way. There's only a thin slice of climate scientists that even know how to access these models and use them. So kind of the role that we're filling at Probable Futures is to translate that data, to first access it, then translate it in a technological way so that it can be served up on the web, and then also help people interpret what it actually means. So the main kind of climate model is what we call a general circulation models, or GCMs. We also often refer to those as global climate models. It's the same acronym, but it does mean general circulation models. And those are very good at predicting continental and global climate trends. They are also very coarse. So the GCM is on the left-hand side of the screen here, and the grid cell on the GCMs is 250 kilometers to a side. So they've been very good at predicting how the climate would change in the past up until now, but 250 kilometers is a pretty large space. It's not going to help you make decisions on a local or regional basis. So regional climate models were developed to help address that. But because of the huge needs of computing for these enormous climate models, regional climate models could be run at a finer resolution. So something like 25 kilometers on the Probable Futures site. Each grid cell is 22 kilometers to a side. And so we can get a better understanding of what will happen at a local level. But until now, these regional climate models had to be run separately. You couldn't run one regional climate model for the entire world. So what we've done is take those GCMs, feed them into the regional climate models, the RCMs, and then we have stitched together the different regional climate models in order to make a global product that has the resolution of the regional climate models. And to our knowledge, this had not been done before now. It certainly hadn't been done in any way that was made available to the public for kind of public use. And on the Probable Futures site, we put a lot of effort and a lot of space into educating people about climate models and how they work. Because if we are going to be truly applying climate science in decision making, we need to understand what this data is. We need to understand what the strengths and limitations of climate models are, what the caveats are. So on probablefutures.org, we do put a lot of effort into educating people on that. We want people to know, of course, want people to understand, the people who are consuming Probable Futures information, want them to understand what's behind it. But really, if you're getting climate model data from anywhere, from a private climate model service provider or some other resource, it's really important to understand what climate models do well and what they don't do well. All right, so let's zoom into some specific places and examine some of these changes. So I'm going to start with Paris. I'm going to look at some places that have been in the news recently. I'm sure you probably all heard that there was a big heat wave in Europe. Maybe some of you are in Europe now. And Paris isn't a place that we generally think about when we think about extreme heat. It has a very mild climate. It has had a very mild climate. And because of that, the infrastructure in Paris, the homes, everything is really designed around a very mild climate. So when these heat waves happen, they're not particularly well prepared for extreme heat. And so one of the things that we do with climate change is think about, the places that are getting very hot, that are hot to begin with. And that, there's a way to think about that, but then we also need to think about the places that are just not prepared and don't have the skill set or the infrastructure to deal with extreme heat. So Paris is an example of that. We're looking at a map from the site of the 10 hottest days in Paris. The way to understand this is the temperature that we're showing here is the average temperature of those 10 hottest days. So the 10 hottest days in Paris at a ½ degree Celsius, maybe higher than this or lower than this, but it averages out to 87. So think of this kind of as a directional and a trajectory rather than specific temperatures necessarily. But so in an average year, it'd be that average temperature would be something like 87. In an unusually hot year or a 90th percentile year, it'd be something like 95. In an unusually cold year or a 10th percentile year, it'd be something like 82. We chose to put these different, basically expose more of the model data behind the maps, because obviously each year is different. There can be there can be particularly warm years, there can be particularly cold years. It's not going to be the same every time. So that's one of the things, like one of the best practices that we need to understand with climate. model data is that it gives you a distribution of outcomes. That's what climate models do. So we need to understand that entire distribution, not just the average, although the average is a good way to just kind of get a sense of it. So we'll work through the warming scenarios here. 1 degree of warming, 1.5, 2, 2.5, and 3. So by 3 degrees of warming in an average year, that average temperature of the 10 hottest days is now at least 10 degrees higher. In a much hotter years could be something like 15 degrees higher. So moving on here to India and Pakistan. So we're looking kind of around the border of India and Pakistan here. Recently, a couple months back, of course, there were extremely high temperatures early in the season. I know that a lot of people in this group are from that part of the world, and I'm sure could explain what that means on the ground much better than I could. And that is why we made this information available, is to take that on the ground understanding, project these climate models forward, and figure out how we can avoid the worst possible consequences. So this is a map of wet bulb temperature. So it's the number of days above 30 degrees wet bulb, so 30 degrees and 100% humidity. And as you can see in this past climate scenario, that temperature threshold basically didn't happen in Hyderabad or really any other place around except a couple of places in Pakistan. So I'm going to move through the warming scenarios here and just see how this very high temperature threshold that is basically unprecedented changes in the future. So 1 degree C, we're starting to see in an average year something like 2 days above this temperature threshold. In a unusually hot year could be up to 6 days. 1.5, 2, 2.5, and 3. So again, you know, these are unprecedented temperatures that we're not used to seeing. And so we need to have kind of imaginative conversations around how we deal with these kinds of conditions in the future, especially when we don't have the experience of dealing with them in the past. I'm going to move to North America here, and we're looking at Vegas. A lot of people know Las Vegas. It's in the desert. This white area here that looks like a lake is a lake. It's called Lake Mead. It's made by the Hoover Dam, the very famous Hoover Dam. But where does the water for Lake Mead actually come from when there's no precipitation in the desert? Well, where it comes from is it comes from upstream. So the water in Lake Mead comes from snowmelt, and it comes from Colorado, the mountains of Colorado, Utah, Wyoming. And so to understand what the future is for Lake Mead, which is the largest water reservoir in the US, it provides water sustenance for about 20 million people and farms in that area. It's incredibly important for that region, which is also a very important economic region for the country. So let's see if we can understand what the trajectory is for Lake Mead when we're looking at upstream in the mountains. So I picked a place here in the Rocky Mountains of Utah. We're looking at a map of the change in snowy days in the future. So the way to understand this map, so where it says kind of at the bottom, let's see, right here, this is the baseline. So in this particular place, they would expect to see something like 54 days a year of snow in that place. In a particularly snowy year, you might see something like 113, and in a really dry year, you might see something like 11. So at 1 degree of warming, this place is already seeing something like a week fewer days of snow. And I'll work through the warming scenarios here. 1.5, 2, 2.5, and 3. So in this particular place in the Rocky Mountains of Utah, by 3 degrees in an average year, you're seeing about half of the snowy days that you might have been in the past. And that is certainly going to have implications downstream, down everywhere downstream of this place, and in particular places that are really important to a lot of people like Lake Mead. So I'll switch gears here a little bit and just talk a little bit more about the organization and the kinds of resources that we're making available. So what we're building, you've seen a lot of the public educational platform at probablefutures.org. That is for everyone. I mean, I get asked a lot, who did you build this for? And we built this for the world to be able to use. The theory is that climate change underpins everything. Climate underpins everything. That means climate change is going to affect everything. And that means every part of life needs to incorporate it into their thinking. So we really built it to be widely accessible and widely applicable. That said, in particular, we built it for the communities that are going to be hit first and worst by climate change, because those communities are likely not going to be able to afford climate, very expensive climate risk analyses services. And so we needed a way for every community to be able to assess their climate risk and act upon it. So when we started Probable Futures, we saw kind of this climate risk service provider industry cropping up, and really felt like we needed to respond to that with a public resource that gave communities access to really the world's best science. So that's probablefutures.org. In parallel, we're also developing a more power user tool that we call Probable Futures Professional, and I'll show you that in a minute. We also, once we finish the completion of the platform, we're going to be working with partners to develop their own versions of the platform. We are making all of this content freely accessible. We have a Creative Commons licensing for it. We're helping people integrate data into different kinds of softwares or into, more community-specific platforms that include the data. And then really all of this, both the data, the maps, and the educational content on probablefutures.org is to support a community of thought leaders and people who are now working on climate change. So probablefutures.org is launching in phases. If you look at our site right now, we have the heat volume and the water volume are live. The land volume is coming next. That'll be released in September, and that will include drought maps, wildfire maps, climate zone maps, and potentially some other types of maps. So that's launching in phases. Probable Futures Professional is an experiment right now. We're trying to figure out if it's useful to people, and if it's useful to people, how can we make it the most useful and the most widely accessible? And so we're looking for some participation and input there from alpha users. And so what Probable Futures Professional is essentially it's a way to bring non-climate data in and put it on top of climate maps. So you can start to explore the intersections of climate change and other parts of society. So it allows you to bring this data in. Right now, I've brought in a data set of the power plants in the entire world. And so we're just looking at part of the world here, but these are all of the power plants, different kind, coal generated, hydro, nuclear, every kind of power plant is put on top of this map. And you can imagine how this, might be useful. And it's got things like the capacity of the power plant within the software. And so then you can start to kind of filter it out and start to tell different stories with it. You can, put different colors on the different different sources, energy sources of the power plants. And then you can take the data back out. So the original data that you put in, the power plant data, I can then take that back out and it's now enriched with this climate data. So first, you have the opportunity to look on it on a map, maybe develop some materials if you're making a case for something in particular, but then you can take that data back out and analyze it in different ways in Excel or Tableau or whatever kinds of tools you use or softwares you use. So if there's a call to this group, I would just say, if this type of tool seems like it would be of use to you and your work, first of all, just let me know. It's good to know those things. And number two, if you're interested in becoming an alpha user of this tool, I'm happy to give you access. Really, all we ask in return is just for a little bit of feedback on how you use it or how you think it could be more useful to you. So we just looked at a lot of maps that are concerning, that are probably worrying. They give us a finer scale understanding of how climate change is going to affect specific places. So what it makes clear is that life is going to change under a changing climate. But the ways in which our lives will be different is really up to us. And that's going to take some imagination. And that imagination can be bound by what we already know about the physical world and how it will change. So we can build a more resilient future. We can build a future where we live within the limits of what the earth and the climate gives us. And we can build one that actually allows us to live well under those conditions and under those constraints. And so to do that, we're going to need imagination. We're going to need help from the most creative, the most visionary people among us. And I do think that this is a little bit of a shift in thinking, because in the media and in popular culture and in places where we often kind of get kinds of imagination, we often hear this binary view of the future with climate change. It's usually portrayed in one of two ways. One, kind of a techno utopia where everything's basically exactly the same, but there's more electric cars and modern architecture. And the second one is perpetual apocalypse. But the fact is, neither one of these are accurate. Number one, unfortunately, is no longer possible. We are already experiencing change. We know that, and we'll continue to experience some amount of change until we get to zero emissions and until the Earth reaches a new equilibrium. So we need to accept the fact that we are going to be experiencing some change, and we're going to need to deal with that change. But number two is avoidable, and it is a ways off. So what we need to do is we need to populate what the probable futures in between look like and use climate science as those constraints. So one of the things that we often think about and talk about, and once we are complete with the platform, going to be looking for partners on, are people that have the ability to tell stories that have something that we call bounded imagination. So using climate science to imagine what the future could be like and what kinds of lives that we could live within those constraints. All right, so I'm getting to the end here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about just our approach as an organization to the work that we're doing and to this space. And it might start with the question of how, how do you expect that this information will help make change and help us actually get through this transition? And that begs the question, how does social change happen in the first place? And this is something that we think a lot about and pay a lot of our attention to and do a lot of research and reading about. And really, our philosophy is that no one knows exactly how climate change happens. How social change happens. When we look into the past, we see these different approaches. There are demonstrations and protests, or legislation, like when same-sex marriage was made legal in the US, or simply sometimes it's the normalization of a new kind of behavior, like when kind of rapid and large-scale curbing of cigarette smoking happened in past decades. And so there are memorable moments to movements like these, but behind these memorable moments, there are many different people in different communities in different parts of the world trying new things, doing what they could within their sphere of influence. So in other words, we are going to need all of the approaches. We're going to need activism, we're going to need policy, and we're going to need individual behavior change. And we're going to need it across many different parts of society. So at Probable Future was designed to be universally applicable to all of these approaches. And I'm just going to run through some strategies for how we're doing that. And I'll start with this idea of encouraging climate awareness. When talking to people about climate change, I'm sure you have heard it or asked it or hear it all the time. What can I do? I mean, you're all here because you obviously asked yourselves that question at some point, but it is a question that just keeps circling back. And I think it's almost surprising that there isn't a more simple, satisfying answer to this question after 40 years of people grappling with the climate crisis. And really, I just think it shows how complex and how deep this issue is. I mean, it reaches into every corner of the earth and every corner of our lives. So in a way, there shouldn't necessarily be a simple answer to this. But we really believe at Probable Futures that one of the most important if you have the ability, please go on mute. Thank you. Great. So what is climate awareness? We've talked a lot about it already. It starts with educating yourself about the physical world and paying attention to all of the different ways that a stable climate underpins our lives. And when you start kind of having that mindfulness on a day-to-day basis, recognizing how we've designed our world around a stable climate, seeing how a stable climate has contributed to your life, it's also pretty easy then to start thinking about how you or your community or your industry also kind of contributes to impacting it. So it's a seed of mindfulness that can be practiced on a day-to-day basis, and it grows. And it becomes a bigger part of your life. It's basically behavior change coming from within. We have seen in many cases the outcome of climate awareness being behavior change. So it's not, we've seen that people have kind of adopted this. It's not that they have a list of 10 things that they're going to do to reduce their carbon footprint and they check it off, but they just start living with this climate awareness. And then the outcome is often deep behavioral change. Democratizing access to climate science. As I mentioned before, this is public data. It's technically freely accessible, but it's sitting on computers and in servers that nobody knows how to use until now. So here we are with Probable Futures, bridging the gap between climate scientists and the rest of the world, empowering people with these tools so that they can understand what's coming and take action. And like I said, we're particularly focused on the communities that are disproportionately affected by climate change. These are the people who need it the most, they need it first, and they need help in addressing it. Orienting the leaders. So, I'm doing some of that right now. You are all leaders in this space at this point. And there are so many people who are either entering this space or they're being asked to work on climate change. And really, we believe that eventually everybody's job will be a climate change job. This kind of social change is not going to be achieved by one person or company or organization. It's going to require thousands of ambassadors and creative, imaginative, courageous leaders across government, business, education, entertainment, the arts. So we spend a lot of time teaching people, spending time with people at different levels within organizations, CEOs, community leaders, teachers, so that they can share their insights about climate change and tell the stories through their own lens and with their own voice. Inspiring the storytellers. Every community and every culture has stories that they live by. and storytellers who make these stories vivid and inspiring. So think about Hollywood, for example. Hollywood actually does help us kind of move social change forward in a lot of ways. Books can do that too. And, we've talked about this idea of imagining new ways of living in the future that are both positive and accepting of the reality of climate change. So we believe that Probable Futures can help be a resource for people, and we can get more of that into the world. And then finally, modeling a new kind of organization. Probable Futures is not a business. We're a bit of an experiment, frankly. And we're experimenting because we believe that the kinds of companies and agencies and organizations that we have now aren't necessarily set up to adequately address the many facets of this kind of change. So we need organizations that can move across boundaries and bring science into art, bring business into science, and many other combinations of that. So we're starting by kind of being an example of that, and would love to support other organizations that are doing the same. We need more collaboration on climate change. So that's what we're doing with our organization, and hope to see many others do the same. I think you all know this at this point. We all have a unique role to play in the climate change challenge, and eventually everyone will be working on climate change, whether directly or indirectly. So I'm so grateful that you're all here for the challenge, and I can't wait to see the futures that you end up imagining.
Thank you, Alison. We're so grateful that you are here with us today. That was a great presentation, a really fantastic demonstration of how to use science data to tell stories. And then thank you for sharing what you all are doing and the work you're doing. We do have a few questions. We've got a little bit of time. I apologize, everyone. I'm still recovering from COVID, so my voice is a little off here. But a few of the questions were about, would you be willing to share your slides with us after this? And is the data on the website? I think it seems like it's public and usable by anyone. Is there an API that organizations can use to pull data from your site? And that's the first question. And then I'll ask, after that, I'll ask Drew if you could unmute and ask your question next after Alison answers.
Okay, great. So the first part of the question, first of all, yes, totally willing to share slides. Also, yes, pretty much everything on those slides are all on probablefutures.org. And we made it so it would be very easy for people to take the maps. So what you can do is you can zoom into a particular place in the maps. You can click on the cells just like I did. I built this presentation from the probablefutures.org site. So you can find a place, click on a cell, take a screenshot. It just downloads to your computer as a JPEG or whatever the format is. And all of the different infographics and things on our site, there's just an easy button and it's downloadable. So we have made it so we want people to go make their own presentations out of these, and again, take their own lens to it. So we've done as much as we can to make that really accessible. On the graph, we have a slideshow of the graph on the site. We're also going to be launching a video with it that kind of does a lot of what I just did. So that'll be available like within a month. And then on the API front, that is something that we're working. We don't have it yet, but we are working on it. And that's part of that Probable Futures professional experience. So there's kind of like a more user interface, which is what I showed you, but we are working on building up an API. It won't be ready, super soon, but we are working on that in the long term. But also, if you want specific data for a specific thing, feel free to reach out because we're already helping people with that. Actually, one of the things that makes it easy is that, so we use Mapbox, and we have published some of our Mapbox tiling, our tile sets publicly. So if you're working with maps and if you use Mapbox maps, you can just take our code and take our recipes and end up getting the Probable Futures data in your Mapbox Studio account. And we're building up more resources on that as well.
Thank you, Alison. Drew, would you like to ask your question, or would you like for us to go to Ahmad's question? Because I saw you had a follow-up as well.
Greg, I think they're somewhat related. So Drew, do you want to ask it? Do you want?
And since Drew is not coming off, he originally asked, I wanted to ask if Probable Futures also has models where we can estimate probable futures of different scenarios, where we implement and meet the sustainability development goals by 2030 or 2050 by integrating different solutions, and how that can be a model of action by showing positive probable futures.
Yeah, so we do not have that, but that exists. And I imagine it probably shows up somewhere in the curriculum. Climate Interactive, are you familiar with Climate Interactive? They have two different types of modeling systems that are available on the web and that allow you to like come up with the solutions, and it shows what you can increase renewable energy, and they have kind of all different parts of the energy system. And then it ends up, you see what you end up with, what global average temperature you end up with at the end of it. So yes, it's called En-ROADS. Thank you. So again, we've been building the site for the past 2.5 years, and I'm just kind of starting to get out and collaborating more with people, but that is definitely something that I'm looking to develop, is a kind of combination way that people can both use the maps on probablefutures.org and En-ROADS and Climate Interactive to do exactly the kind of thing that that you talked about, Drew.
Thanks. Ahmad, did you want to follow up with more?
I think it's sort of along the same conversation. And Alison, thank you so much for giving the talk. Super powerful. And yeah, it was just more, many of us have been using Project Drawdown as kind of the framework for looking at solutions. And it was more like, how does that pair up with these really powerful visualizations, so we can see kind of what happens if you stack, like solar, wind, EV, plant-rich diets, and refrigerant alternatives together. Like, what's the potential impact of that on CO2 reductions, and thereby, the potential climate impact. Because I think some of us struggle. There's like 100 solutions out there, and it's like, it's hard to understand the impact and context. And this seems like a really cool tool to do that.
Yeah, I think there's, if there are people here who are looking to collaborate on something like that, I am totally open to that. I think it's a natural place where it fits in. And, we have a scope at Probable Futures. I mean, we're not looking to replace anything that anyone else is doing well. Things like Climate Interactive and Project Drawdown. I mean, we have a resources page on our site, and Project Drawdown is right there because, those are complements to this. They're all kind of pieces of the puzzle. And I would love to make it more comprehensive, or more, kind of fit in together more intentionally, if there's a way to do that.
Well, thank you for the questions, and thank you, Alison. We are actually up against the hour here, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time, including Alison's. So I want to thank Alison very much for being here. And this is really timely in the course for both cohorts who are looking at climate communications, and of course for all of us. One of the big messages that we always have is that there is no silver bullet to addressing climate change. It takes all people with all skills working on this problem. And I think you demonstrated really nicely how you need scientists to create the science, or to do the science, you need storytellers to convey that, and you need all the other jobs and roles in between. So thank you so much for your presentation and for being with us today. And thank you all for joining us. Alison, if it's okay, I might share a few extra questions that are quite small with you via email afterwards, and I can share those with everyone on Slack. So again, thank you all very much. And in particular, thank you, Alison, so much for being with us today.
Thank you. And also feel free to share my email address with everyone. And please do reach out.
All right. Thank you. Have a great
Thanks,
day,
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank
you.
Thank you so much.
you.
Thank you, Alison.